Welcome to the lecture on the second half of Book 2 of Plato's Republic. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll look at the issue of political foundations from the perspective of what it is for a state to be just. A state, I said, arises, as I conceive, out of the needs of mankind. No one is self-sufficing, but all of us have many wants. Can any other origin of a state be imagined? There can be no other. Then, as we have many wants, and many persons are needed to supply them, one takes a helper for one purpose, and another for another, and when these partners and helpers are gathered together in one habitation, the body of inhabitants is termed a state. True, he said. And they exchange with one another, and one gives and another receives, under the idea that the exchange will be for their good. Very true. Then, I said, let us begin and create an idea, a state. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist. He was the first systematic philosopher, a student of Socrates, and the teacher of Aristotle. Plato was alive from about 428 to 348 BCE, and it's important for us to remember when we read Plato's works that most of the time in Plato's works, his main character is named Socrates, although we shouldn't confuse the words that are coming out of Plato's literary character, Socrates' mouth, with the actual philosophical ideas of the historical philosopher Socrates. There's quite a bit of scholarly debate about what the actual historical Socrates actually believed. Some of it, no doubt, is what Plato has his literary character, Socrates, saying, since Plato, of course, was Socrates' student, but some of it, we imagine, is just Plato's own ideas. So what we should think is that when Plato has Socrates speaking in his works, those are Plato's ideas, mainly. Since what we're investigating here is an idea in political philosophy, it'll help us to understand what political philosophy is. Political philosophy is the philosophical subdiscipline concerned with the specifically normative, that is, the ought-related questions concerning political entities, political powers, and political relations. Some of the questions, although not all of the questions, that are asked by political philosophers are: what makes something a political state rather than, for example, just a group of people? What distinguishes legitimate states from illegitimate ones? No doubt you've looked around the world today and you've seen some governments that seem to be better or more legitimate than other ones. Is there a cutoff point where some government stops being a legitimate government, some state stops being a legitimate state? What grounds political authority and political obligation? How is it that the governments of states are allowed to tell their citizens what to do? Why is it that citizens are politically obligated to do what governments tell them to? What is the proper scope of the political state? That's both within the state's boundaries, geographical boundaries, and outside of them. What can the state tell people to do legitimately, and what's off base for the state to be telling somebody to do? What are the conditions for citizenship? What are the legitimate forms of political governments? Do all legitimate governments need to be forms of democracy or not? Do all legitimate governments need to derive their power from the people or not? And under what conditions can a state be overthrown? If a state isn't doing its job, is that enough? Or do further conditions need to be reached, satisfied, before a state can be overthrown? In understanding political philosophy, it's also important to understand that political philosophy is distinct from a sister discipline known as political science. While political science and political philosophy are similar in many ways, confusing the ways that they investigate their questions will lead to much confusion about what political philosophy is. The objects that are studied by both political science and political philosophy are the same thing, namely political objects. But they study these things from two different perspectives and with two different sets of methodological tools. So what differentiates political science from political philosophy at the foundations is methodologies and perspectives. The political scientist is concerned with the descriptive issues of what states are in their various manifestations, how states and citizens actually do and have interacted with one another. The methodology of the political scientist is, therefore, historical, or anthropological, or sociological. The political philosopher, on the other hand, is concerned not with the descriptive issues of what states are, but the normative issues of how states ought to be, how states and citizens ought to interact with each other, and the reasons behind these things. The methodology of the political philosopher is philosophical in nature, not historical, anthropological, or sociological. And the methodology that's used by the political philosopher is primarily the methodology of the philosophical ethicist, although we don't thereby need to say that ethics and political philosophy are exactly the same discipline. They're just very similar to one another. Plato's project in the Republic is one of political foundations. Plato is looking at what it is at the ground level to be a state, to be a citizen of a state, and then building a picture of a state and of citizenship from there. A popular methodology that's employed when examining fundamental questions concerning the nature and scope of the political state is to search for these very political foundations. The thought is this: if we can determine what ultimately makes states the sorts of things they are, gives states the sorts of powers they have, obligates people to one another within the state, then we can construct the ideal state from these political foundations. And you saw in the quotation that I gave you at the beginning of this lecture, that's exactly what Plato wants to do. Plato's project here is to search out these foundations and then to show us the sorts of states that are justified by these foundations, as well as, of course, the sorts of states not justified by these foundations. It's important to notice that what Plato is doing in Book 2 of the Republic is giving us an analogy between the individual who's a member of a state and the state itself. At the start of Book 2, Socrates, who, remember, is Plato's mouthpiece, is ostensibly discussing what it is for an individual person to be just, for an individual person to have the property of justice. However, says Socrates, since justice is a virtue both for the individual and for the state, and since a state is much bigger than the individual, we might learn something about the individual by looking at the state, and it might be much easier to learn about the individual by looking at the state. Thus we have this analogy here. Justice for the state is to the state itself as justice for the individual is to the individual, him or herself. A well-ordered state is thus exactly like a well-ordered individual. And we should keep this analogy in mind when examining Plato's views on justice. A number of the moves that Plato makes in the Republic are very clever in that he argues for one thing while claiming to argue for another, and manages to get two different conclusions from one argument. So again, while we're investigating what justice for a state is in Book 2 and in this lecture, we're doing it ostensibly for the reason of figuring out what justice for an individual is. One of the central issues of political philosophy is what are political rights, who has them, and why do these people have the rights that they have? Political rights are the sorts of things that individuals and collectives, groups of individuals, have insofar as they're appropriately related to some political entity. So, for example, you and I have political rights as citizens of whatever country we're citizens of. We have those rights because of our citizenship. Now, maybe people who aren't citizens of the country that we're citizens of also have some rights, for example, in warfare with our country. They have those rights because of their relationship with our country. These political rights may be derived from moral rights, or they may go above and beyond moral rights. But it's important to recognize that there's at least an in-principle conceptual distinction to be made between the rights of a person as a mere person and the rights of a person as a citizen, a member of a state. Good states, then, are the ones that respect and promote the rights of their citizens, while bad states are the ones that disrespect, suppress, or otherwise trample on the rights of their citizens. All well and good, but this doesn't tell us which comes first: the picture of the just state or the picture of the rights of the individuals. Which is primary here, the state or the individual? According to Plato, states come first. Individuals and their rights and the consideration that we should have for individuals as citizens of states, those come second. While a more modern philosopher, or maybe a more liberal philosopher like, for example, Locke or Mill, would conduct political philosophy by starting from the rights of individuals and then working up to the properties of states, Plato goes in exactly the opposite direction. So, for example, you might see in Mill's philosophy a discussion of the primary foundational rights that any citizen of an acceptable state would have, and then Mill would build up a picture of an acceptable state by looking first at those rights of individuals. Plato says no. Look at what a good state is first, and then the rights of individuals, how individuals ought to act, how they ought to be treated, that follows from the picture of a good state. For Plato, in order to conduct a political philosophical investigation at all, we have to first consider the sort of thing that a state is and ought to be. And only then can we talk about the rights and duties of the individuals within the state. And this makes some good sense, since when we're considering the rights and duties of individuals within a state, what we're considering is the rights and duties of individuals as citizens of that state. These are rights and duties that those individuals have precisely because they're members of those states. So while Mill or Locke might say, how can you possibly consider a state first if a state is just a collection of people? Plato could respond, how can you possibly know the rights of a citizen of a state unless you know what a state is and what a state ought to be? The central theoretical notion that drives Plato's argument in the second half of Book 2 of the Republic is the notion of specialization. What makes a state rather than a mere collection of individuals is that the members of a state work together toward the achievement of some common good. This is what we saw Socrates saying in the quotation from the beginning of this lecture. And what makes this collective work, the work that these individuals engage in collectively, beneficial for all, is that individuals can specialize. Each individual can perform some task needed by all, and each individual can perform some different task than the others. Thus, instead of X number of people all doing the exact same thing, Y, and ending up with X times Y of that thing, X number of people can each do a different thing, A, B, C, etc., and then each of the X number of people can end up with some A, some B, some C. So think. You need somebody to bake bread, you need somebody to build houses, you need somebody to lay plumbing. If everybody baked bread, everybody would end up with bread, but then there'd be no reason for people to work together. If I can bake just as much bread as you can bake, and you can bake just as much bread as the next person can bake, we should all just stay home and bake bread, and then we don't need to band together in a society. We don't need to form a state. However, if we specialize, if I bake bread, if you build houses, if the next person lays pipes for plumbing, then I can bake bread for all. You can build houses for all. The next person can lay the pipes for plumbing for all. So we all end up with more than we would have had to begin with. Let's look at this notion of specialization as it relates back to the individual person, because recall that ostensibly here we're investigating the proper structure of a state only in order to know about the proper structure of an individual person. As an aside, of course, Plato's being cagey here. He does care about the state. The reason why he's talking about the individual at all is so that he can talk about the state. But back to the individual. An individual also has specialized parts, each of which perform its own function in aid of all the other parts and the whole as well. So think, your heart pumps blood. Your heart pumps blood so that your muscles can get oxygen, so that your circulatory system can deliver what it needs to deliver to the different parts of your body. Your muscles do what they do so that you can move yourself around, so you can feed yourself, so you can breathe, so you can excrete waste. All of these functions happen for the sake of the other functions as well as for the sake of the entire organism, you. And what makes you one individual rather than just a whole bunch of parts is that these parts work together. So back to the state, what makes a state is that all of its citizens work together. Without collaboration, we wouldn't have an individual, we would just have a whole bunch of body parts laying around that don't work together. There wouldn't be one thing there. Without collaboration of individuals within the state, we no longer have a state. So, says Plato, the foundational thing we need, the primary thing we need at the lowest, most fundamental level, is for individuals to specialize and work together in a state. If they don't do this, we don't have a state. We just have a bunch of individuals and nothing else. What is it that specialization within a state can get us? It can get us a couple of very important things. One is care for the state as it currently is, and another one is promotion of the interests of the state, pushing the state to where it ought to be or can be. In order for the state to function and for the state to flourish, it has to be the case that there are institutions in place to protect, to care for, and to promote the state. These institutions would be things like a government that manages, coordinates all of the individual functions, an educational system, a national defense system, a system of health care, and a system of infrastructure, among perhaps many other things. Now notice that none of these things are for the individual alone. These are all in promotion of the state itself. The individual's function within the state is to be a member of the state. Individuals have the political rights they have, as well as the political duties that they have to perform their specialized task because of their citizenship status. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the duties that an individual has within a state are forced on the individual. There can be all sorts of freedom to choose what you do within a state, but the thought is, insofar as you're a member of the state, you need to act that way. Well, what about the individual? Let's talk about the individual for a second, since the individual has been playing second fiddle here. As we noticed, more liberal philosophers like Locke or Mill want to build a political philosophy by starting with the individual. So Locke or Mill might balk at Plato's political picture. They might say something like, the individual exists for the sake of the state? Certainly not. The state is a mere collection of individuals. Plato, you've got this backwards. But, as you can probably already see, this would be a misunderstanding of Plato. Plato isn't claiming that individuals don't exist without states, or that all individuals have to be members of states. What Plato is saying is that insofar as someone is a citizen of a state, their primary duty is to that state and their fellow citizens. So it's true that states are collections of citizens. Metaphysically, that's what a state is. However, once a citizen is part of a state, the citizen's job is to be a citizen of that state. Now, if someone doesn't want to be a member of a state, they can leave. Plato isn't saying here that people should be captured and forced to be members of states. But a person can't have their cake and eat it too. If you're a member of the state, then you need to act like one. If you don't want to act like one, then you don't get the benefits of citizenship, and you should leave. This might sound quite a bit like a number of contemporary political disputes that we've been having, especially in the United States. So what Plato's saying here, even though it was written 2,500 years ago, is relevant to what's going on today in the United States and in much of the Western world. Much of the political polarization that we see in contemporary political debates comes from implicit arguments about the legitimate scope of the state. Before we can settle questions of which specific policies ought to be in place, we need to decide, what a state should look like. So oftentimes when you hear people arguing about whether this specific policy or that one should be adopted, whether this specific candidate for office or that one should be elected, what they're really arguing about is something much deeper, their vision of what a state should look like. So, if we're to understand and adopt something like Plato's methodology, we should first have a philosophical conversation about what we think states are. Because unless we settle that question first, we aren't going to be able to decide whether we should adopt this position or that one. Plato's picture is a very plausible picture. He says, what should a state be at minimum? Well, at minimum, he responds, it needs to be the sort of thing that protects its citizens both from foreign invaders and from unnecessary and preventable death. It should promote its own flourishing via the education of its citizenry, and it should further its own interests via diplomacy and trade. So the picture of what states should be and how individuals should be related to states that many of the very individualistic members of society have just isn't a picture of states, Plato would say. If individuals all want to have their own piece of property, to govern themselves, to not interact with others at all, to not be citizens of a state, to not be united under a common flag, that's fine. But insofar as people want to be members of, for example, the United States, they need to act like it. But here's a question for you. Let's say that we agree that people's lives go better when they band together, when they protect one another, when they provide care for one another, when they educate one another, and when they enrich one another's lives. Let's say that we buy all of that. That seems very plausible. Here's the question. Is a state necessary for any of that? Couldn't we accomplish all of this via non-state interactions? You and I, one-on-one, could provide care for one another, could protect one another and educate one another. We could enrich one another's lives. We don't need a state to do that. So why does a state become necessary at some point? It might be the case, Plato might say, that any group that decides to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, it's all from the preamble to the Constitution, just is ipso facto a state. Is that true? What is it that makes something a state rather than just a mere collective of like-minded individuals? That's a question I'll leave you with. In this lecture, we've looked at the idea of the just state as the political foundation, the thing that we need to decide on first before we can figure out how individuals are related to states, what sorts of political rights individuals have, what it even is to be an individual that's a citizen of a state. Plato's picture looks at some points like it's denying the rights of the individual. However, if we get a clearer picture of what Plato's up to, we can see that what he's claiming is that insofar as an individual wants to be a member of a state, that places certain burdens on the individual, requires certain things of the individual. If the individual doesn't want to be a member of a state, that's fine, but insofar as he or she does want to be a member of a state, he or she needs to act like it. Thank you.